thank you all very much again for your patience. Thank you for taking the time to join us for today's presentation on the TN visa. The TN is one of the most common and popular visas that our firm helps clients navigate, and there is good reason for that. We'll talk about those reasons today. Before we dive in, quickly introduce myself. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga. I am a senior associate with Scott Legal PC. And if you have a question during today's presentation, feel free to send it in through the question and answer function on Zoom. I will be monitoring those. You can also use the chat if you'd like to send in a question. I do plan to get through all the questions by the end of the presentation. I may save them for the end, but I do plan to get through all of them. We do record our webinars, so we are recording this one. We post them to our YouTube channel. So if you haven't had a chance yet, do take some time, visit our YouTube channel. We take pride in putting really high quality information on our YouTube channel, including our webinars, as well as shorter videos on a variety of immigration topics. So take some time and check that out. And as I suggested, our firm does focus on business immigration, but we handle the full spectrum of immigration options in the US. So whether you're dealing with a family-based immigration issue, a temporary visa, a green card, whatever it is, please don't hesitate to reach out to us if we can be helpful. With that being said, also, a final point, we'll follow up with you by email after this presentation with a link to our YouTube channel, a link to where you can schedule a consultation if you have questions about your particular case, as well as a TN guide. And that guide really is a comprehensive guide that pulls together our best information, and we hope it's helpful to you. The PowerPoint presentation will also be in that email, so no need to write down everything you see on your screen. So let's go ahead and get started. The TN visa, why is it so popular? What is it? So basically the TN visa was established under NAFTA and is probably the easiest option for a national of Canada or Mexico to come to the US to work for a US employer. So if you are a national of Canada or Mexico, meaning you have a passport from one of those two countries, and you have a job offer in the US, then the TN is definitely something worth considering. There are a few other requirements, and we'll talk about those during the presentation. But again, the application process is streamlined. It really is a wonderful option to come to the US to work. So how do you qualify? What are those requirements? As I mentioned, you need to be a citizen of Canada or Mexico. And you need to be coming to the US to work in one of the listed TN occupations. So if you're at your computer right now, I recommend that you Google TN NAFTA regulations. I'll be referring to these throughout the presentation. And one of the first links you find will be to the actual regulations, 8 CFR 214.6. And if you scroll down the regulations, pretty soon you see a list of occupations. It starts with accountant, and then there's architect, computer systems analyst, et cetera, et cetera. You need to be coming to the US to work in one of these listed occupations. Not every occupation is listed, unfortunately, but there are dozens that are, and you can see that here. They are in the medical professions. There are scientists and teaching roles, as well as a variety of others. So take some time and make sure your occupation falls under one of the listed occupations. You, second of all, need to have the required qualification for your listed profession. So for example, if you're coming to the US to work as an accountant, you need to have either a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or a professional license. Again, that is listed in the regulations. So go to the regulations, first of all, to make sure your occupation is listed, and second of all, to make sure that you qualify for that occupation. Each occupation has its own qualification. So whereas I just said an accountant can qualify based on a professional license, Excuse me, an economist cannot qualify based on a professional license. They need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. If we keep scrolling down, we see management consultant. Excuse me, just one moment. The management consultant category is unique because you can qualify for it based solely on experience. So again, find your occupation, then go to the regs and make sure that you are familiar with what you need to qualify and that you do qualify, whether that's based on a professional license, your education, or your professional experience. Fourth down the list that you see on your screen, you must have a prearranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the US. So you do need a job offer from a US employer before you apply for a TN visa. And finally, in the job in the US that you're looking to fill, you must be employed to engage in professional activities consistent with the profession. So what does that mean? I don't point to the regulations to figure this out because the regulations are not actually going to tell you what the job duties are. But there's another resource that's published by the US government. It's called the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or the OOH. So again, if you're at your computer, we can take accountant as a good example. So if you Google OOH, accountant, click the first, should be one of the first links that appears on the screen. For the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is a part of the US Department of Labor, you will come to a page for accountants and auditors at the OOH. And along the top of the screen, you'll see some tabs: summary, what they do. What they do is the second tab. Click on that, and you'll actually see the job duties. So these are the job duties that the US government thinks that someone in this role, the role of accountant, does. So sticking with our accountant example, they examine financial statements, compute taxes owed, inspect account books, organize financial records, things like this. So the Occupational Outlook Handbook will have job duties for hundreds of jobs, including the jobs that are listed in the TN regulations. So if you're looking to come to the US on a TN visa, you do want to make sure that the job you'll be performing in the US has you performing job duties that are consistent with the Occupational Outlook Handbook. We'll be referring to those resources throughout this presentation, but that is a high-level overview of what the TN requirements are. So one of the most common questions we get oftentimes from employers is, does the TN visa require sponsorship? And before answering this question, it's first important to talk about what sponsorship is. When someone uses the word sponsorship in the context of US immigration, they usually have in mind something like the H-1B visa or a green card. And what sponsorship requires is that the employer test the US labor market, that they actually post the job, see if they're US citizens or permanent residents that are interested in the job. They usually have to pay a prevailing wage, which is higher than minimum wage. They need to basically promise that they will not bench the employee, meaning when the employee shows up, that they actually have work, that they're not inactive. Oftentimes the employer needs to pay for the employee to return back to their home country. So a lot of requirements are placed on the employer if the employer is required to sponsor the employee. So it makes sense that employers care about the answer to this question. The answer is that the TN does not require any of those things. So for that reason, we say the TN does not require sponsorship. So the TN employer does not need to first see if there's a US worker who's available and capable of filling the job. They don't need to pay a prevailing wage. They only need to pay the minimum wage, the same wage they would pay any worker that they have. So that's a very important distinction with the TN. It really is a very low barrier to entry for US employers. So what do TN employers need to do? Well, they do need to sign a letter, and that letter does need to explain what the job is that the person will be doing, how much they're going to be paid, how long they're going to be employed. That's not a binding contract. So when the TN employee shows up in the US, even though the TN letter will say we expect to employ this person for, say, 3 years, the employee is still at will. And what that means is that they can be fired just like any other employee, and they can quit just like any other employee. So the TN employer letter really is just explaining to the border officer or to USCIS or to the consulate what this role is and what they expect will be done in the role, what the job duties are, what the expected pay is, etc. And the employer will sign that letter. Now, if the employee is within the US and is applying for a change of status to TN status, then the employer does need to sign the application form. It's called the I-129. But again, that doesn't create significant additional responsibilities. The employee is still at will. The I-129 is still, like I said before, conveying to the government what the expectations are for the role. So again, the requirements on the employer are extremely low when it comes to the TN. Our firm does have conversations with employers. Oftentimes they do need this explained to them. So we're happy to do that. And again, our YouTube channel, our blog, we do post on this. So if you are talking with a US employer that needs more information on what their role is for a TN, you can point them to our YouTube videos or our blog for more information on that. And of course, if you want to retain us to talk with them, we're happy to do that too. Now, the TN visa is available for both nationals of Canada and Mexico, but the application process is slightly different for each. Just brief overview, Canadians have all options available to them, including applying at a port of entry. They can show up at an airport or a land crossing and provide their TN application there and can be approved on the spot. So that's a very easy, simplified process available to Canadians. Nationals of Mexico must apply at a consulate. Again, it's not a hugely burdensome application process. The documentation is relatively light. We'll talk about what that includes. But nationals of Mexico cannot apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Canada can apply at a consulate if they'd like to. And both nationals of Canada and Mexico can apply from within the US. If they're here, say, as a student or as a visitor, they can apply to change their status to TN status. So let's go into a few more details. The TN visa for Canadians can be issued for up to 3 years. So in other words, when they apply either at a consulate or at a port of entry, if the job opportunity is for 3 years, usually they'll get a stamp in their passport and a handwritten note saying they, will have TN status for 3 years. Basically, they are visa exempt, but they are given the ability to come in TN status for 3 years. Nationals of Mexico can actually get the TN visa for up to 4 years. And again, that visa is what allows them to seek entry into the US. Whether you are Canadian or Mexican, when you enter the US, you're given TN status. That's not to be confused with the visa. TN status is given for up to 3 years. And what that means is each time you enter the US on your TN visa, you're given an I-94 that will say you're in TN status and you need to leave the US within 3 years. So it can be granted for up to 3 years. If your job opportunity is for less than 3 years, then you'll probably be given an I-94 for only that period of time. So the I-94 can give you TN status for up to 3 years. And again, that is the period of time you can stay in the US in TN status. Why would a Canadian go to the consulate? One reason is that you can only apply at a port of entry if you have a Canadian passport. So if you are Canadian, but your spouse is, say, from China or from a country that is not Canada, then your spouse or your children, if they don't have a Canadian passport, needs to apply at a consulate. So oftentimes the TN principal, the person applying for the TN, will want to join their family members at a consulate. But otherwise, nationals of Canada will almost always apply at a port of entry just because it's so easy. Real quick, the dependent spouse and children, if they're approved, would be given TD status, or if they're applying for the visa, a TD visa. And what that gives them is the ability to enter and exit the US and to study in the US. It does not give them work authorization, unfortunately. That is only given to the TN applicant. And a quick note, the TN applicant is only given given work authorization on a TN to work for the TN employer. You cannot work for another employer unless you have TN approval to do so. And you can have TN approval for more than one employer. You just need to make sure you have that approval before you start working for them. So one quick note on nationals of Mexico, the consulate, once you apply at the consulate, and you do that by submitting the form DS-160 online, the consulate will sometimes reach out if you're renewing your visa to let you know you can do that through mail. So sometimes you don't actually need to go to the consulate for an interview, but that really is dependent on the consulate's discretion. So, and they'll reach out to you once you've applied to let you know if you qualify for the mail-in option. I mentioned before that there are dozens of TN occupations. We started with accountant as our example, but not all occupations are equally challenging or easy to be approved for. Two occupations that are especially challenging are the management consultant category and the economist category. And these are challenging for two different reasons, or I should say for very different reasons. The management consulting category is challenging because, as I said before, you can qualify as a management consultant under the TN regulations based on experience alone. It's one of the very few occupations that does not require either a degree or a professional license. And the professional license itself will oftentimes require a degree. So if you are a national of Canada or Mexico and you don't have a degree, a college degree, say, then the management consulting category is one of the only categories you can use to come into the US on a TN. And again, the TN is one of the easiest options to work in the US. So the US government is aware of this, that the management consulting category can be a catch-all for those who don't have a degree. And so they closely scrutinize applications in the management consulting category. That's not to say that these applications are not approved. They are frequently approved. We help people with this category often. But it is to say that if you're applying in the management consulting category, you do need to be very thoughtful about how you apply. I will quickly explain that there is a spectrum even within the management consultant occupational category in terms of what is challenging and what is not. What is not challenging is if you are coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm. If you're coming to the US to work for McKinsey, Bain, BCG, any of these, management consulting firms, then the application is not especially challenging. So I just got a notification that my camera may not be working. So if please feel free to send me something in the chat or Q&A box if you can't see or hear me, but I think it's working fine. So if you're coming to the US to work as a management consultant for a management consulting firm, that is a fairly straightforward application. What is challenging is when you're coming to the US to work as a management consultant for a company that is not a management consulting firm. So an example I like to use is, let's say that there is a company in the US that manufactures and sells solar panels. And you are an expert in solar panels. You live in Mexico, and you have 5 years of experience in solar panels. The US employer wants to hire you to come to the US and advise them on their processes for making, designing, and selling solar panels. That would be a risky application because, again, the company is a solar panel company. It's not a management consulting company. So how would you structure the application and work with the US employer to improve your chances of being approved to work for that solar panel company? And again, this is for any company that is not a management consulting company. I'm going to use the solar panel company example, but what I'm about to say are broadly applicable tips for any company that's not a management consulting company. Really, what you want to keep in mind is that the government, when you're applying as a management consultant, the government has in mind someone who comes to address a specific challenge facing the company. And then when they're done doing that, they leave. So what does that arrangement look like? And keep in mind, maybe it helps to have McKinsey in mind. When McKinsey is hired, let's say you work for a company that's hiring a McKinsey consultant to address a challenge. That McKinsey consultant does not typically become a full-time W-2 employee of your company. They become maybe a paid contractor, or McKinsey becomes a paid contractor to your company. And McKinsey is paid to look at a specific challenge at your company, to offer advice on that challenge, and then they're gone, right? McKinsey doesn't stick around to fill a permanent role at the company. That would be strange. And the US government thinks the same way. So if you're coming to the US to work as a management consultant for a company that's not a management consulting firm, some concrete pieces of advice. Work with the US company to actually have a consultants agreement in place that defines what is the challenge that the US company is facing. How are you uniquely qualified to help them address that challenge? What will be the deliverables that you'll give to the US employer at certain milestones? So months 1 through 6, you are going to evaluate X problem. Months 7 through 12, you are going to offer advice to management on how to address this. Months 13 through 16, you are actually going to evaluate how those recommendations go. And you're going to be paid according to those deliverables. And then when you're done, you are gone. You're not going to need to stick around for the full 3-year TN period. Again, this management consulting category, it can be beneficial if you're not asking for the full 3 years. You're asking for a year or 2 years, again, to just address the challenge that the company, the US employer, is facing. It's ideal if you're a contractor rather than a W-2 employee, again, because management consultants rarely come in and fill a permanent role. They should be filling what's called a supernumerary role, which is beyond any permanent roles at the US employer. So again, this is a challenging category, but these applications are regularly approved. We help clients with this frequently. So if you are looking at coming into the US in the management consulting category, a consultation would probably be worthwhile for you. Let's switch to the economist category. This category is challenging for completely different reasons, and that is that in November of 2017, the US government issued a policy memo that explicitly narrowed what economists do. So I said before, look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook to figure out what someone does in a certain role. And that is especially true for economists. So if you Google OOH economist, pull up that page at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, click what they do. What economists do? Economists typically do the following. They research economic issues, they conduct surveys, collect data, analyze that data using mathematical models, statistical tools, and other software. They interpret and forecast trends, they advise businesses, governments, and they present their research. and I'm not going to read the entire page, but the OOH is quite specific in terms of what economists do. What this 2017 memo said is that what economists do not do is work as financial analysts or market research analysts. So what do financial analysts do and what do market research analysts do? Financial analysts are really those who look for opportunities to generate profits, oftentimes for investment banks, hedge funds, etc. At the end of the day, their job is to analyze opportunities to generate profits for their employers or their employers' clients. Market research analysts are really those who are looking for ways for their employer to market their products or services. They're basically working in marketing. So contrast that to what the OOH page for economists says economists do. You want to make sure you're very closely aligned with what the OOH page for economists says that economists do. If you are looking to come to the US to primarily work as a financial analyst or a market research analyst, I would say two things. First is there may be an opportunity for you to work in the management consultant category. Again, you would need to be addressing a specific challenge, but if that challenge is, say, a marketing challenge, you may be able to come to the US as a management consultant to address that marketing challenge. Alternatively, you might need to look for another visa option. So the H-1B might be a good option. For example, maybe an L1, maybe an O1 visa. But the TN, if it turns out it's just not a good option, then you may need to look for other visa options. So let's talk about the TN application process. I already touched on this when I talked about differences between Canadians and Mexicans who are applying. Again, Canadians can apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Mexico cannot. They must apply at a consulate. And Canadians will provide at a port of entry the job offer letter, which again is a letter signed by the US employer. And it's going to talk about what TN role the applicant is going to fill, what their job duties will be in the US, how they are qualified for the TN, so whether that's education, experience, or a professional license. It will also separately talk about why they're a good fit for the role at the company. So that's separate from the TN qualification. So the TN qualification may be they're coming to work as an economist because they qualify based on having a bachelor's degree in economics. Separately, though, they might be a good fit for the company because they've been working as an economist for 20 years and they're very accomplished in that role. You don't want to confuse the two, okay? A TN economist cannot qualify based on experience. Even if they have 20 years of experience, that's not how they qualify for the visa. They qualify based on a degree, okay? And that's clear again in the regulations. But it is good to go into the letter why they're a good fit for your US employer. And the TN letter will also talk about how much you'll be paid in the role and how long the employer needs to employ you, again, up to 3 years, because that's the maximum period of time that you can be granted TN status in the US. Some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. You can figure this out through the CBP webpage, or we're happy to help you with that if you want to use our services. Nationals of Mexico, again, cannot apply at a port of entry. If they're applying at a consulate, they would first file a DS-160. They would file that online, and they would bring with them to their interview at the consulate the application materials. I realize I skipped over the other application materials when I was talking about Canadians. What are those materials? So in addition to that job offer, the TN employer letter that would be signed by the employer, the TN applicant also needs to bring with them, whether to the consulate or the port of entry, proof that they qualify. And again, what I mean by that is according to the TN regulations. So that's either going to be your diploma, could include your transcripts showing that you completed courses that are relevant for that job. Or if you're applying based on experience, it's letters from past employers talking about how you have the minimum necessary requirement. So for the management consultant, you can actually qualify based on 5 years in a field of specialty that's related to your engagement in the US. So using our solar panel example, you would need letters if you're applying based on experience from past employers saying you've worked for at least 5 years in the field of solar panel manufacturing or solar panel sales. And you'd need original signed letters talking about your work experience. So job letter from the employer, proof of your qualifications for the TN. You, of course, need to bring your passport with you. And it's always good to bring with you proof of your ties outside the US. So proof that you have a bank account in Canada or Mexico. If you own a home outside of the US, proof that you own that home, things like that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So again, you'd bring that with you whether you're applying at a port of entry or at a consulate. If you're applying at a consulate, once you submit the DS-160, you'll be scheduled for an interview. At the interview, that's when you would bring with you all those documents I just described, and you would answer any questions that the officer has, usually about the role, how you're qualified for the role, what your job duties will be. Sometimes they will give you a chart and actually ask you to break down your job duties, a blank chart, and you have to actually write your job duties and the percentage of time each week that you'll spend on each one. So it's good to prepare for that interview. And they may do that also at the port of entry, not just at the consulate. And finally, nationals of Mexico do sometimes have the opportunity to renew by mail. That's a decision made by the consulate, and they'll let you know that after you file the DS-160. The final option to apply for TN status, and again, this is available for nationals of Canada or Mexico who are inside the US already, is to file for a change of status through USCIS. To do that, they would file the form I-129. That would be signed by the US employer. And the application would include copies of everything I described before. So a copy of the letter signed by the employer describing the job, copies of your diplomas, copies of your transcripts, excuse me, a copy of your passport. And then if you're approved, you would be given an approval notice with a new I-94 printed on it that would have your new status, TN status, and the validity period printed on it. One quick side note, I keep referencing transcripts. Why would you need transcripts? So if you're qualifying based on your education, so let's take the accountant as an example. So again, looking at the regulations, an accountant can qualify based on a bachelor's degree or a professional license. Let's say you're qualifying, you don't have a professional license, and you're qualifying based on the fact that you have a bachelor's degree. Your degree needs to be related to the job. So let's say you went to school in Canada and studied English and have a bachelor's degree in English, and you're applying to be an accountant based on your English degree. That application is very likely going to be denied, even though it is not written anywhere in the law that you need a specific bachelor's degree. In fact, one of the only categories that it is specified is hotel manager. So if you look at hotel manager, it says baccalaureate or licenciatura degree in hotel or restaurant management. That's one of the only categories where it says you need a degree in a certain major, right? Everything else just says baccalaureate or licenciatura degree. Nonetheless, the government will still want to see that the degree is related to the job. So going back to accountant, if you have an English degree, you're probably going to be denied because they want to see you have a degree related to the job. What if your degree is not in accounting, but it's in math, or it's in finance or statistics? That could very well be okay, because a couple things. First of all, if you go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook, and again, you want to do this, and we would do this for our clients, if you look at a tab on the Occupational Outlook Handbook, not the What They Do tab, which has the job duties, but the How to Become One tab. If you click on that, and again, that's a tab available for hundreds of applications, you'll see the first sentence: accountants typically need at least a bachelor's degree in accounting or a related field. So this is helpful for you if you're applying as an accountant and your degree is in, say, economics, or your degree is in statistics. You can say the Occupational Outlook Handbook doesn't require a degree in accounting. It requires a degree in a related field. That's what I have. And then in addition to that, you'll want to bring your transcript to show that you completed coursework in classes that prepared you to be an accountant. Okay, so bring the original, if this applies to you, if you have a related degree, bring your original transcript or a certified copy, and actually be prepared to show the officer how you completed specific classes that prepared you to do the job that you're applying for. Excuse me. Okay, so some tips and common pitfalls. We always recommend that you call ahead to the port of entry, especially if you're unfamiliar with the procedures. During COVID, especially, ports of entry started changing their hours and having unique or different, entrances they wanted people to use. So it always helps to go to the CBP website, get the phone number for the port of entry, call beforehand just to make sure you know what the procedure is, so there are no surprises the day of. Ensure that the employer contact who signed your employer letter is available for a call when you are approaching the port of entry or going to the consulate for the interview, because government officers will sometimes just pick up the phone, call that person just to make sure it's a legitimate job offer. So just give them a heads up that, tomorrow I'm going to be at the border between, noon and 5 o'clock. If you could just have your phone on you, that'd be appreciated. And usually the officer's not going to ask extremely detailed questions. It really, again, is just to verify that this is a legitimate job offer. Bring your original documentation. If you're going to a port of entry or the consulate, they encounter a lot of fraud. So if you bring copies of these documents, they are very likely going to reject them. So take the time to get your original diploma, take it out of the frame, take official transcripts, take an original signed letter from the employer, original signed experience letters from past employers if you're qualifying based on experience, because you don't want to take the time to show up only to find out that your documentation is being rejected. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. So what that means is it's not a green card. You do need to convince the officer that your intention is to leave the US at the end of this TN job. So how do you do that? It's usually, by the way, this doesn't come up until you've renewed the TN multiple times, meaning 3 or 4 times at least. But there's always a chance it could come up. So again, bring documentation showing your ties outside the US, bank account statements outside the US, proof that you own or lease property outside the US, things like that. Think creatively if you need to. That being said, the TN visa can be renewed indefinitely. As long as you are qualified, you can continue to renew your TN visa, and that is a wonderful thing about it. So with that, we can go ahead and turn to questions, and we will go down the list. Do you need a job offer and also a TN support letter, or is a job offer with all the information sufficient? A good question. You do need a TN support letter. And the reason is there's information in that letter that is different from a job offer letter. In fact, border officers and consular officers oftentimes don't even care about the job offer letter or even the job posting. What they want to see is the letter from the US employer that describes how the person qualifies for the TN visa, again, education, experience, or professional license, depending on your occupation, what the needs of the company are, who the company is, why it actually needs an accountant, a lawyer, etc., and what the job duties are in the US. So that TN letter is important. The job offer letter is not a substitute. Does the job offer need to state a period of 3 years? Because most US employers are at will. Does the offer letter need, or should the TN letter state this? So again, job offer letter doesn't need to be provided. The TN letter should specify how long the US employer intends to employ the person. So oftentimes it's going to be the maximum 3 years. Because as the question stated correctly, employees are still at will. So again, the TN letter is not some kind of, not intended to be, and it's fine if it says this, it's not intended to be some kind of a binding contract between the employer and the employee. What it is information, honest, accurate information provided to the US government about the intentions of the US employer. They intend to employ this person for a period of 3 years. They intend to have this person performing these job duties. Of course, the person's at will. So if it ends up not working out, if the person, doesn't perform the job duties well, they can be fired. If the person decides, you know what, I want to go back home, I don't like this job, they can quit. They are at will. So that is fine. But the TN letter should still explain the intended period of intended employment. Who signs the TN support letter? Human resources, a hiring manager, legal counsel? Is it someone specific at the company? Really, no. It can be anyone who is in a role that's familiar with the TN role. So oftentimes, if it's a smaller company, it can be the CEO. If it's a larger company, it can be a human resources representative. Either is fine, as long as they are an employee of the company and they can speak to the information that's in the TN letter. As a Canadian with a corporation, I'm working with a placement agency that prefers a setup corporation to corporation. They would provide this person with a W-2. Okay, can I meet corporate to corporate agreement and receive a W-2? So the answer is yes. So if there's let's take an example. Let's say that McKinsey Canada wants a McKinsey Canada consultant to come to the US to work for a client in the US. They will still be paid by McKinsey Canada, or they could be paid by McKinsey US, and they'd be providing services to the client, but the client is not going to necessarily pay the individual. They're going to pay McKinsey. That is fine to do. What is not fine to do is if you own the US employer. So let's say you're Canadian, you start a consulting company in the US, and that consulting company contracts with another US company, and you're going to be paid from your own US company. That's a problem. The TN does not allow self-employment. So as long as you don't own the Canadian company or the US company, as long as you don't own the US company that is paying you, that is fine. And yes, a corporation to corporation agreement is generally fine as well. How long should one wait to apply for a green card after entering the US on a TN? Well, first of all, if you're entering the US on a TN with the intention of applying for a green card, that is a big no. I would not recommend doing that. When you're entering on a TN or renewing your TN status, anytime you're applying for TN status, you cannot have the intention of applying for a green card. Again, the TN is a non-immigrant visa, and government officials are looking for immigrant intent, and it is your burden to convince them that you don't intend to immigrate, meaning stay in the US and seek a green card on that visit. That being said, if you're in the US on a TN and work is going well, and one day your employer comes to you and says, hey, we want to keep you permanently, that's fine. There's no prohibition on that. You should not pursue that or file the application, usually within about 3 months of entering on a TN. Similarly, if you fall in love, And it just ends up making sense that you apply for a green card after you've entered, but that wasn't your intention when you entered. In general, it's good to wait 3 months before pursuing that green card option. I did not understand the difference between TN status granted for 3 years and the visa stamp. What are the differences and what does it imply? So basically, a visa is a piece of paper that is put into your passport that gives you the ability to ask a border officer to let you into the US. And a visa is going to have an expiration date. For a TN, the visa is usually going to be granted for, if you're a national of Mexico, up to 4 years. If you're Canadian, up to 3 years. And again, for a Canadian, what the visa is a stamp where it says, will be working in TN status for this employer for 3 years. But let's focus on nationals of Mexico because the distinction is clear since Canadians are visa exempt. Nationals of Mexico are going to go to the consulate in Mexico and they are going to get a TN visa put in their passport, again with an expiration date. What that document does is it allows you to ask to be admitted into the US before that visa expires. You can ask for entry on day 1 that you get the visa, as long as it's valid on that date. And you can ask for entry on the date that the visa expires. That's fine. You can wait till the last day of that visa and ask for entry into the US. Each time you ask for entry, if the border officer says, I allow you to enter the US, at that moment, you are granted an I-94 form. It is visible online. You can access it online, and you should each time you enter the US. And that I-94 form is going to say, you entered the US on a specific date, and you were given TN status for usually 3 years. So let's take an extreme example. Let's say your TN visa is issued for 4 years. You enter on the very last day your visa is valid. You're probably going to be given 3 years of status inside the US. Okay, and you need to leave before that status expires. When you enter the US, your visa is irrelevant. All that matters is your I-94, and you need to leave before that I-94 expires. Before you enter the US, the I-94 is completely irrelevant. All that matters is your visa, because you need to seek entry into the US. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Status is when you're in the US. The visa is when you're outside the US and need to seek entry into the US. Can a TN or TD visa holder manage their long-term or short-term rental property on the side? Definitely a gray issue. You are not given work authorization outside your TN employment. And the government is very strict about that and tends to define that broadly. So if you are actively managing properties for income, my point of view on that would be there is a very good chance that the government is going to argue that's work and you should not do it. A viable option would be to have someone in the US who is doing that active work. It's fine for you to be a passive owner of stocks, of property, of whatever that's generating an income for you. What's prohibited is for you to work in the US outside of what your work authorization gives you authorization to do. While working on a TN1 for a US company and being paid where I own the Canadian company, can I do work for other contracts? No, you cannot work. If you're inside the US, you cannot work outside a work authorization. And if you're in the US on a TN, your work authorization is for the US TN employer. Just as you can't enter the US on a B visitor visa and do work for a Canadian company, you can't do that on a TN either. So you need to be very, very careful about complying with your work authorization. I have an approved I-140 with consular processing, can you tell the officer at the border that you'll return to Canada for consular processing? You can. So the TN, again, because it's non-immigrant and non-immigrant visa, having an I-140, which is the first step of a employment-based green card application, is risky because the government might say, we think you're going to actually seek a green card while you're here. And what you would say in response is that actually I must consular process, therefore I must leave the US. So that is an argument you can make. Most officers would be okay with that, but frankly, there is a chance that they will say, I just don't like the fact that you have a pending green card application, so I'm going to deny your application. So it is a risk you run and depends on the conversation you have with the officer. I'm a junior in college, currently applying for summer internships. Most applications ask if I will need sponsorship. Is it okay to say that I won't need sponsorship? So what I say is, if you are given a yes/no form where you are not being given the opportunity to explain this, because again, employers tend to misunderstand what sponsorship is. And if you're given a yes/no questionnaire saying, do you require sponsorship? I would probably check no. Because again, none of the requirements that the employer has in mind regarding sponsorship are at play for a TN. However, if you're in a conversation and they say, do you require sponsorship? I do think it's worth having a conversation and explaining to them, I don't require sponsorship insofar as an H-1B or a green card is required. I will be applying for a TN visa, which means that all I'll need is a letter from you just explaining the job. And if you frame it that way, that is accurate, and it will likely alleviate the majority of their concerns. And if they still have concerns, we are happy to speak with an employer if you do want to use our services and explain that, and we do that with some regularity. All right, I hope this presentation was helpful. Thank you all again for your patience with the technical issues. I do hope you'll take time to visit our YouTube channel, our blog, schedule a consultation if that would be helpful. Visit us for future webinars. We try to do these weekly, sometimes multiple times a week. So we hope to see you on future sessions. In the meantime, stay well, be safe, and we hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.